In medieval Europe, over 90% of the population weren't knights, kings, or nobles. They were peasants. Poor, land-tied, and mostly forgotten in the great tapestries of history. But while castles rose and empires clashed, it was peasants who kept the world running one muddy step at a time. So what did medieval peasants actually do all day? A medieval peasant's day didn't start with an alarm clock. It started with daylight or the sound of roosters, barking dogs, or the church bell in the village. With no clocks for ordinary people, the sun and seasons set the daily rhythm. In summer, peasants could be up as early as 4 a.m. In winter, work might not begin until around 7. Many peasants slept in what is called segmented sleep. Families went to bed soon after sunset, woke again in the middle of the night, and then went back to sleep until morning. In those hours between, people might pray, feed the fire, tell stories, or visit neighbors by lantern light. Mornings were rarely easy. In their small huts of wood and mud, peasants slept on straw mattresses, often sharing them with their whole family and with fleas, lice, and sometimes even mice. Clothes were simple and usually worn day and night. Rough wool tunics for men, long dresses for women, patched and reused for years. There was no such thing as work clothes. What you slept in was what you worked in. By sunrise, the village came alive. Smoke rose from fires, animals were led from their pens, and the sounds of daily work returned. Whether plowing fields, grinding grain, or carrying water, the day's labor began early and did not end until nightfall. Breakfast for a medieval peasant was nothing like the big meals we think of today. There were no eggs, no bacon, and no fresh fruit. The first meal of the day was quick and simple, just enough to stop the hunger before work began. Most mornings started with bread, usually rough, dark loaves made from rye or barley. It was much harder than the soft wheat bread that rich people ate. Old bread was often dipped in weak ale or in pottage, a thick soup made of grains and vegetables, often left over from the night before. Ale was a basic part of the diet. Water was often unsafe to drink, so even children had ale. It was weak, low in alcohol, and gave both energy and calories. Sometimes there was butter, cheese, or onions, but variety was rare. Food depended on the season and what the family could afford. In hard times, breakfast might be no more than a crust of bread or a handful of peas. Meals were shared from one bowl or pot, with spoons made of wood or horn. Knives, if a family had one, were personal tools carried at the belt and used for both eating and work. Breakfast was short. There was no time to sit by the fire or relax in the morning. Once the food was gone, the day's work began, and for most peasants, that meant heading to the fields. For the medieval peasant, work was not just a way of life, it was survival. And for most, that work meant farming. Most peasants lived under the feudal system. They did not own the land they worked. The land belonged to a lord, who gave them small strips to farm in return for labor, rent, and taxes. This tied peasants to the soil, creating many generations of families who worked fields they would never truly own. After breakfast, peasants put on their wooden shoes and started their work. In spring, fields had to be plowed not with machines, but with heavy wooden plows pulled by oxen. The work was hard and slow, often needing groups of men to guide the animals, while others broke up the soil with hand tools. Summer meant planting, weeding, and constant care of the fields. Women and children helped by scattering seed, pulling weeds, or tending small gardens for food. In autumn, the harvest was the busiest time of all. Men cut grain with sickles, women tied the bundles, and children picked up the stalks left behind. Every member of the family had a role. Farming was not only about crops. Peasants raised animals too: sheep for wool, pigs for meat, cows for milk, and chickens for eggs. These animals often lived inside the house with the family, their warmth helping to heat the home in winter. The cycle of work was not a choice. A poor harvest meant hunger. A failed one meant starvation. On top of this, peasants had to give part of what they grew to the Lord as rent, and to the church as a tithe. What remained for their family was never guaranteed. Tools were simple wooden plows with iron tips, scythes, hoes, and sickles. Farming methods had changed little for centuries, leaving peasants to rely only on their own strength and on the weather. A single storm could destroy months of labor. Yet the fields were not only for work, but also for community. Villagers often worked side by side, sharing tools, animals, and effort. Survival was not something done alone, it was shared. As the sun rose higher, the day pressed on. For peasants, the fields were their world, hard, endless, and unforgiving. While farming was the main part of peasant life, it was not the only work that filled the day. Beyond the fields, peasants had many other tasks to keep their homes running, and these jobs could be just as hard as planting or harvesting. For women, the work was constant and varied. Brewing ale, for example, was often done at home. Ale was not just a drink, it was safer than water and an important source of food energy. Women boiled grains, mixed in herbs, and looked after barrels of ale that would be drunk by family, shared with neighbors, or sometimes sold at the market. Spinning and weaving were also daily tasks. With spindles or later spinning wheels, women turned wool into thread and cloth. Clothes were made by hand, colored with plants, and repaired again and again until they were only rags. Men often took on heavier work in the village. They fixed roofs, built carts, repaired fences, and shaped wooden tools. Blacksmithing, carpentry, and milling grain at the local watermill were also needed, though these were usually special jobs for certain workers, not daily tasks in each home. Children worked too, as soon as they were able. Boys herded sheep, chased birds from fields, or fetched water. Girls learned to spin, cook, and care for younger brothers and sisters. The idea of childhood as free time simply did not exist. Inside the home, chores never ended. Fires had to be kept burning. Bread was baked in shared ovens, pots were cleaned with sand or ash, tools were sharpened, buckets fixed, and walls patched against the wind. Each season brought its own jobs. In autumn, pigs were killed and the meat salted for winter. In the cold months, plows and wagons were repaired while the fields lay empty. Spring and summer returned the focus to the land. For peasants, free time was almost impossible. Every hour of the day was spent keeping life going, getting ready for the next season, or repairing damage from the last. Work was endless, and it never truly stopped. In a peasant's life, food was not just to eat, it was also a way to tell time. The day was marked not by hours, but by meals. The most important meal was the midday dinner. After working for hours in the fields or at home, peasants stopped around midday for their largest meal of the day. It was not fancy. A normal dinner was pottage, a thick soup made of grains, beans, peas, or root vegetables, cooked slowly in one pot. What went in depended on the season. In spring, it might have leeks or onions. In autumn, turnips, cabbage, or whatever could be pulled from the ground. Meat was rare. A small piece of bacon or salted pork might be added on special days, but most of the time, the pot had only plants and grains. For protein, peasants relied on beans, lentils, or sometimes a little cheese. Bread was always present. It was dark and rough, made from rye or barley. Heavy and filling, it gave energy more than taste. Bread was dipped into the stew or used to soak up ale, which was drunk at almost every meal. This ale was weak, with very little alcohol, and even children drank it. Water was often unsafe. Meals were shared. Families sat together around the fire or on benches, eating from the same pot or dish. Bowls and spoons were usually made of wood, though richer peasants might own metal or ceramic ones. Knives, if a family had one, were carried at the belt and used both for work and for eating. There was no lunch break like today. Dinner was only a short pause before going back to the fields, housework, or service to the Lord. Work continued for the rest of the day. In the evening, supper was smaller, often just leftovers from the midday pot. By then, food and energy were low. Families ate in the dim light of the fire before going to sleep. The peasant diet was simple, repeated day after day, and tied to the seasons. Food was never wasted or taken for granted. It was survival, one pot at a time. For peasants, life was not only work. The village gave them rare chances for trade, meeting others, and even celebration. The village was the center of peasant life. At its heart stood the church, a place for prayer, but also for rules and community gatherings. Around it were cottages, barns, animal pens, and small plots of land. It was a small world where everyone knew each other, and everyone knew each other's business. Market days were one of the few times peasants could step outside daily work. Villagers brought extra grain, eggs, wool, or handmade goods to sell or trade. In return, they might buy salt, iron tools, or cloth things they could not make themselves. The market was also the place for news, gossip, and meeting others. For many, it was the closest thing to fun. Festivals gave another break from constant work. Harvest feasts, holy days for saints, and village fairs brought music, dancing, and games into the year. Ale was shared, performers entertained, and even peasants could forget their struggles for a short time. But these events followed the farming calendar celebrations only came when the fields allowed it. Not all village life was happy. Fights often happened over land, grazing animals, or the bailiff collecting taxes. The village square was also where punishments were shown, people locked in stocks, fines given, or disputes judged by the lord's men. Still, the village was more than just huts. It was the structure of peasant life, a place where work, faith, and community came together. Without the village, no peasant could survive. Together, they shared work, rare joys, and the heavy weight of medieval life. In the medieval world, faith was not only for Sundays. For peasants, religion was always present, shaping every part of the day and every season of the year. At the center of village life stood the church. Its bell called people to prayer, its priest gave guidance, and its walls held the hope of salvation. Attendance was not a choice. On Sundays and holy days, every peasant gathered there, kneeling on cold stone floors, repeating prayers in Latin, a language most could not understand. The church was more than a place to pray. It also held power, collecting tithes, 1/10 of every peasant's crops, animals, or work. This was a heavy burden on poor families. A good harvest meant plenty for the church. A bad one meant hardship for peasants, but the duty still had to be paid. Religion also set rules for food. More than 100 days each year were marked for fasting. On these days, meat, eggs, and dairy were not allowed, so peasants had to eat fish, vegetables, or whatever simple foods they had. Fear was part of this faith. Illness, storms, or poor harvests were seen as signs of God's will. Priests warned of sin and hell, while saints were called on to protect fields, animals, and families. Belief often mixed with superstition. Charms, blessings, and small rituals filled the gaps where the church could not reach. Life turned around the church calendar. Seasons of prayer and feasts like Advent, Lent, Easter, and Saint Days broke up the long work year, giving both spiritual meaning and rare moments of rest. Yet the hope of heaven was always matched by the fear of eternal punishment. For peasants, religion was not just belief. It was law, duty, and the hope that after a hard life, there might be peace in the next. When daylight ended, work did not stop and moved indoors. Peasants had no light except fire, candles, or oil lamps, so evenings were short and simple. Supper, eaten at sunset, was smaller than the midday meal. It was often just leftover pottage, bread, and weak ale. Meat was rare, so most families ate vegetables, grains, or dairy. After eating, families turned to small tasks. Clothes were patched, tools were fixed, and food for the next day was made ready. Women spun wool or flax, while children helped with simple chores or gathered firewood. Social life did exist, but it was small. In some villages, neighbors gathered to share ale or talk, especially in winter when farm work slowed. Fun was simple: singing, telling stories, or playing games with dice or wooden pieces. Outside, darkness was a danger. With no streetlights, travel was risky. Roads were rough, and wild animals or thieves were real threats. Most peasants stayed indoors after dark. Evenings ended early compared to today. Hard work and little light meant families often went to bed soon after sunset. Fires were kept low to save fuel, and the house grew quiet, ready to rise again with the morning light. Sleep for medieval peasants was far from comfortable. Most families lived in one-room houses, and space was small. Whole families, parents, children, and sometimes grandparents or servants often shared the same bed or slept side by side on straw. Bedding was simple: bags filled with straw or reeds, covered with wool blankets or animal skins. These gave little protection from pests. Fleas, lice, and bed bugs were common, and animals kept indoors for warmth added dirt and smells. Sleep was also different from today. Many peasants had what is called segmented sleep. Families went to bed soon after sunset, but many woke again around midnight for an hour or two before sleeping again until dawn. In this time, people prayed, kept the fire going, or did small household tasks. Noise and breaks in sleep were normal. With animals nearby, babies crying, and no privacy, nights were rarely quiet. In winter, the cold was another problem, with families huddling together to keep warm. Even with these hard conditions, sleep was needed after long days of heavy work. Peasants rose at first light, and every hour of rest mattered, even if it was never truly peaceful. For peasants, daily life was shaped less by the clock and more by the seasons. Farm work followed a yearly cycle that decided survival. In spring, fields were plowed and planted. This was one of the busiest times of the year, with whole families working to prepare the soil, sow crops, and fix tools and houses damaged by winter. Summer meant long days of caring for fields, pulling weeds, and watching animals. Children often guarded livestock in pastures, while adults worked in both the home and the fields. Autumn was harvest time, the most important season of all. Grain, vegetables, and fruit had to be gathered quickly, stored, or dried for later use. Villages worked together, since any delay could mean spoiled crops and hunger in the months to come. Winter slowed the work in the fields, but it was not a season of rest. Jobs moved indoors, repairing tools, spinning and weaving cloth, brewing ale, and killing animals for meat. Food often ran low, and hunger was most dangerous during this time. Religious festivals and feast days also broke up the year, giving short breaks from work. But overall, the life of peasants followed the same natural rhythm: the rising and setting of the sun, the turning of the seasons, and the never-ending fight to survive. If you like this glimpse into the daily grind of medieval peasants, don't forget to hit like and subscribe for more deep dives into history. Now here's a question for you. If you had to live just one day as a medieval peasant, what part would challenge you the most? Let us know in the comments, and we'll see you in the next one.